Hey everybody, TacticAngel here, back on the PlayStation 4, today for another look at a commander in World of Warships Legends, this time Nikolay Kuznetsov, in this episode of The Man, the Math, the Legend. Like my ship reviews, we'll first look at the history of the man in question, hit some analysis, his abilities, and then talk about how Kuznetsov fits in with different inspirations. As usual, I should have left an index down in the description if you want to skip around, but otherwise, let's just jump into it. Nikolay Gerasimovich Kuznetsov was born on July 24th, 1904, in what was then Medvedki, Russia. But, as we are probably aware, when Kuznetsov was 13, the Bolsheviks led a bloody coup, setting in motion the creation of what would become the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. 2 years after this, Kuznetsov joined the fledgling military maritime fleet of the USSR, or more simply, the Soviet fleet. It was worth calling the Soviet fledgling because it had several things working against it. The Russians were not exactly the cutting edge of naval warfare prior to the revolution. The civil war between the Reds and the Whites reduced those numbers, and the mass murder of experienced naval officers on both sides during and then after the revolution didn't help much either. As we go over his rise and fall within the Soviet Union, it is important to understand the turbulent, arbitrary, and frequently bloody nature of Soviet politics. That said, this is the world that Kuznetsov entered into at the young age of 15, not because the Soviets were particularly interested in child labor for their boats, but because he lied about his age, instead saying he was 17. He would graduate from the Frunze Naval School in 1926 and the Naval College in 1932, after which he received a spot as executive officer on the Krasny Kavkaz, a Svetlana-class cruiser. Within a year, he was promoted to commander and transferred to the Charovna Ukraina, a Nakhimov-class cruiser he served on first as a watch officer. By 1936, the first parts of the war in Europe were playing out in Spain. Though there was very much a real civil war going on there, it was also something of a proxy war with France, Mexico, and the Soviet Union supporting the ruling Republican regime versus the nationalists backed by Germany, Italy, and Portugal. Kuznetsov found himself as part of the Soviet attaché connected to their support of the Republicans. This wasn't a position that afforded him much actual command experience, but it was a promotion, and it did give him a first-hand experience on what modern war would look like. By 1939, he was appointed People's Commissar of the Navy, which you might say is something like being the Chief of Naval Operations or the First Sea Lord, a position he confessed to feeling quite comfortable with at just age 34. That is not just surprising due to his age, but the first People's Commissar of the Navy was executed for no good reason, and his replacement was executed, along with his wife and son, for having the gall of suggesting that maybe, since he had absolutely no naval experience, just maybe, he shouldn't run the Navy. In any case, Kuznetsov, whether confident, brave, or foolish, was apparently the right person to lead the Soviet Union into World War II. Doing several things that Stalin didn't like, feeling apparently open to disagree with him, but never falling so far out of favor so that, he got himself executed or something. It is perhaps this cavalier attitude that actually cemented Kuznetsov a place in naval history, when, on the brink of war, he acted boldly to save the Red Fleet. In the lead-up to Operation Barbarossa, the somewhat sudden but definitely not unpredictable or even unexpected invasion of Russia by Germany, Kuznetsov kept his army on a heightened level of alert. He knew from first-hand experience as naval attaché in Spain the threat aircraft posed to modern navies. Being a little more forward-thinking than his contemporaries, Kuznetsov even had a large bunker built to accommodate his entire operation months beforehand in the event of war with Germany. On June 21st, 1941, General Kuzkov and Marshal Timoshenko summoned Kuznetsov. Though they knew that war with Germany was certainly possible, they instructed Kuznetsov not to respond to any German provocation. Though this order undoubtedly came from the top, he realized that technically he didn't work for them. That evening, he took the fleet to Condition 1, the highest state of readiness, and told his navy that not only could they shoot hostile targets, that they must, and ordered any unknown airplane to be engaged. Though the Russian army suffered a massive defeat in the first days of Operation Barbarossa, none of the Russian Navy ships were lost in the initial blitz. It's important to understand where the Russians were at the beginning of World War II. The Red Fleet in 1941 possessed only 3 battleships, 7 cruisers, 47 destroyers, 213 submarines, and around 300 smaller vessels, and those were divided into 4 operational areas. Immediately, it is easy to see that really the Red Fleet could not afford any losses. And though the Soviet Navy did not have the sort of numerous or dramatic naval campaigns that the Royal Navy or the United States Navy had throughout World War II, they did assist in escorting 77 convoys to and from the Soviet Union, helping provide materiel and provisions to keep the Russians in the war. Following World War II, Kuznetsov would fall out of favor with Stalin, leading to a demotion to Vice Admiral. But after Stalin decided he didn't really care to run the boat department, and he didn't really care for the next guy either, he reinstalled Kuznetsov to the People's Commissar of the Navy again. Of course, when Stalin died, the Soviet Union was still the Soviet Union, and the next guy really didn't like Kuznetsov and demoted him for a second time. At this point, Kuznetsov retired from the Navy and died in 1974. However, it is worth mentioning that 14 years after his death, and after decades of veterans campaigning on behalf of their dead commander, he was posthumously promoted to Admiral of the Fleet of the Soviet Union, around 3 years before the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Kuznetsov is included in legends for his willingness to disobey orders in service of his countrymen, an act which saved the lives of thousands of men under his command, and which allowed the Soviet Union to remain in the fight. Really, as much as I might be pointing out what a truly awful place Socialist Russia was, in ordering his fleet to Condition 1, Kuznetsov was very likely forfeiting his life and the lives of his family if he was wrong, and that is a respectable commitment to his duty. Kuznetsov exists in the game as the more offensive cruiser commander for the Soviet ships, and for that reason alone, he actually is probably the commander of choice, at least from tiers 5 through 7, since so much of what the Russians do is spam HE from long range. Anything that you can do to extend that range is a crucial advantage. He's gifted with the key abilities that are really going to help you do a lot of that high explosive damage, set a lot of fires, and do so from an increased range. But his base trait is also a benefit to high-level Russian cruisers, or really any cruisers looking to play from absurd distances. In terms of overall commander abilities, I will go ahead and circle the abilities you will probably want to use and X out those abilities that you should probably avoid. And I've cheated a little here because I've struck through a couple of abilities but not exactly crossed them out. I will explain what I mean when I get to those. For your Tier 1 ability, you can really choose either one of these. Burn It Down is going to definitely help you out by setting more fires, and since you're encouraged to use a lot of HE at pretty much every level in these ships, this isn't exactly a bad choice, at least not for ships between tiers 1 and 4, where the range of your guns doesn't really give you any significant advantages to exploit. You might say that beyond range is not really all that useful in tiers 1 through 4, but for tiers 5 and up, you probably want to start to develop a bit of a range advantage over your average cruiser, and since you are so visible, it's a good idea to use range to your advantage for survival. So I would suggest beyond range at the levels where Kuznetsov is really dominant. In your second slot, I've half crossed out Before It's Too Late, and not recommended Intuitive. This is probably going to upset some people. On another line, these would actually be quite a bit more useful, and certainly at lower tiers, these are more competitive choices, but Before It's Too Late will grant you a very small benefit to torpedo detection, but in my experience, fractions of a second rarely give you enough time to save your ship from slamming into those metal fishes. Intuitive can be useful at tiers 3 and 4 mostly, where you actually have sonar, but by the time you get to tier 5, you should really be distancing yourself from too many knife fights. On top of that, the Budyoni's radar is a neat trick, but probably the less useful of the consumable options. This does improve when you get to the Shores and Chapayev, at least in the range category, but the bonuses you're going to get in terms of duration here is maybe a second, give or take. What you're left with is a sixth sense that tells you the sort of stuff you probably mostly already know, since you're very likely floating around on the outside of the map. And even if you have the opportunity to use it against a destroyer, the Russian cruisers aren't exactly exceptional at running down enemy destroyers. Thus, I would tell you that Igniter works on every level, and particularly when you get to tier 5 and above. And then at that point, it really does start to shine over the other two options here. In the third slot, we have the choice between speed, AP penetration and damage, or HE penetration at the expense of damage, at least theoretically. Now, I would suggest equilibrium of power at pretty much every tier, with perhaps exception to tier 4, where you're shooting 180s, so you probably won't struggle as much with penetration of HE. That said, there are some fringe cases that it will help you still penetrate and do damage, so it still isn't a bad choice there, just maybe not as necessary. For anybody confused about how this ability works or why you'd want to lower your damage, essentially what you're doing is trading off a bunch of 0-point shatters of HE shells for basically getting a lot fewer of those, but doing less damage per shell. Usually this actually works considerably in your advantage against pretty much everything other than destroyers, though it does still leave you with enough damage to pretty handily dispatch destroyers too. The other two abilities here aren't exactly bad choices at any level. A bit of extra speed on these ships is appreciated, considering the distant playstyle. And though you don't actually spend all that much time shooting AP in these things, there are certain advantages to punching through, but you should keep in mind, if you want to choose this, that the greater distance you are shooting, the more penetration of your shells will drop off. So in general, the higher tier you are with this, you're getting less and less return on this investment. In slot 4, you have the choice between steer clear and fixated. In general, I don't particularly care for steer clear because the benefit it gives you is less than half a second if you have a sub 10 second rudder shift. And I can't remember ever getting my rudder knocked out, or at least not very often, in a Russian cruiser. For that reason, I would strongly suggest the boost to precision and dispersion. Naturally, the greater the range where you're doing combat, the more that you're going to want to get every bit of accuracy that you can, unless you're not a good shot, in which case you probably won't enjoy playing Russian cruisers very much. At the legendary level, you can choose between refill station and fully packed. Though you can get additional consumables at any level, realistically there aren't that many cases where you're going to need an extra hydro or 4 planes in a single match. Where you will get a lot more benefit is those tier 7 cruisers, where the Kutuzov ends up with an additional smokescreen and the Chapayev ends up with a third heel and an additional exceptionally long-range radar. For that reason, I would suggest leaning towards refill station on every other rank, and if you think you're going to do fine without any additional consumables, it's a perfectly reasonable choice for tier 7 as well. In terms of non-traditional or cross-class potential, I'm going to just cross out all of Kuznetsov's cruiser-only abilities. As you can see, this leaves a pretty narrow possibility for using him in Soviet ships that are not cruisers. Essentially, you could make a destroyer with a higher fire chance and a poor man's twist and track, at least the Sixth Sense part of it. Something you actually can't do with Feligula. And none of these remaining choices are necessarily that bad for a destroyer. Essentially, you could make this work, particularly if you wanted to have a more competitive sea detectability with other destroyers, and choose inspirations to increase your stealth, hit points, gun performance, speed, or incoming fire dispersion. But understand, if you do try to do something like this, you are probably tying up the best cruiser commander the Russians have to make this non-traditional build. Do the abilities work with a battleship? Well, the only Russian battleship in the game right now is the Imperator Nikolai, and I wouldn't recommend it. In terms of inspirations for Kuznetsov, if you're even close to the suggestions that I've made in this video, the Norman Scott is probably going to jump off the shelf, because at long range, again, you're probably going to want all the accuracy you can get. After that, you really do have a grab bag of decent choices, none of which are far and away the best. As you can see here, I'm using von Müller because the further back you play, the faster you need your ship to be if you want to, or if you need to help your team play the objectives. Naturally, Bruce Fraser works similarly here, but has the lower powered general speed ability. I will give a shout out to Philip Vine on higher tier ships because just like I've been harping on accuracy at long range, it works the same in reverse, and increasing enemy dispersion helps you more the further you are from the target that's trying to shoot you. The other choices I'd put forward are really choices I have seen people make that are attempts to counteract some of the weaknesses of higher tier Russian cruisers, or alternatives to the build choices I've already mentioned. And those basically fall into two categories, and those are the French firebugs and the concealment experts. Since it is very likely that you're going to be using equilibrium of power, you can expect less HE damage from your HE shells. André Roux, and to a lesser extent Louis de Fournay, help restore some of the damage that you took off of your HE shells by equipping equilibrium of power. The argument against it is that the reason you're shooting HE is really the fire chance more than the actual HE shell damage, so a few more percentage points back isn't going to drastically change your damage potential. If you want to use Concealment Expert, then what you need to realize is that what you're doing is reducing your concealment from really, really bad to above average, or maybe average. This will increase the distance between your base sea detectability and your maximum gun range, which is a benefit. And as pointless as it may seem, the greater your sea detectability, the larger the benefit you get from these inspirations. At least in terms of overall distance, your sea detectability decreases. Even if after you apply these advantages, you are still probably going to be one of the most visible cruisers in any particular match. Going along with this, Le Monnier is a reasonable choice since he will reduce the time it takes for you to reduce your visibility back to those base detectabilities. And I would say he's more than a reasonable choice if you either wanted to run him with Scott or to try to do the most you can to limit your detectability, a common tactic on light cruisers in the game, by choosing Le Monnier with Mikawa. As an inspiration, Kuznetsov is a pretty solid inspiration for cruiser captains and a nice addition to the game. In particular, I am most interested in seeing how he can help out American cruisers, which are pure gunboats, at least after the Omaha. This is not to say that the English, Japanese, and German cruisers wouldn't also benefit, but both the English and the Japanese cruisers derive considerable amounts of their formidability from their torpedoes, and German AP damage is exceptional on their cruisers, but only really effective at close ranges. So while he's certainly usable on them, you might be taking away from what you're otherwise good at if you spend too much time firing at extreme distances. In any case, those have been my thoughts on Kuznetsov. I hope you have enjoyed this video. As usual, let me know what you've thought down in the comments section, and I'll see you guys on the next one.